The fashion of the 19th century is renowned for its corsets, bonnets, top hat, bustle, and petticoat. But today I'm going to talk about not only women, but also men's fashion in the mid to late 19th century period. 1840s. Women in 1840s fashion is characterized by low and sloping shoulders, a low pointed waist, and bell-shaped skirt that grew increasingly voluminous throughout the decade. Evening dresses were often off the shoulder. Hair was parted in the center with ringlets at the side of the head, or styled with loops around the ears, and put into a bun at the back of the head. Paisley or crochet shawls were fashionable accessories, as were linen caps with lace frills for indoor wear, and large bonnets for outdoors. Capes with large collars were fashionable. For the men, very fashionable men sported low, tightly cinched waists with rounded chests and flared frock coats that gave them a rather hourglass figure, inspired by Prince Albert. They also wore tight trousers and waistcoat, with high upstanding collars and neckties tied around them. Hair was worn quite long but swept to the side. Mustaches and sideburns were popular. In 1850s, women in the 1850s skirts were domed and bell-shaped, supported by crinoline petticoats. They often featured deep flanks or tiers, long bloomer, and pantaloons trimmed with lace were popular. Tiered cape jackets were fashionable, as were paisley patterned shawls. Deep bonnets were worn and hair was swept into buns or side coils from the center parting. Men wore matching coats, waistcoats, and trousers, with hairstyle characterized by large mutton chop, sideburns, and mustaches. After the style set by Prince Albert, shirts had high upstanding collars and were tied at the neck, with large bow tie. High fastened and tight-fitting frock coats were also very fashionable, though a new style called sacco, a side-length, loosely fit jacket, became popular. The bowler hat was invented around 1850, but was generally seen as a working hat, while top hats were favored by the upper class. For 1860s, women 1860s women's dress featured tight bodies with high necks and buttoned fronts. White lace was popular for collars and cuffs, as were low sloping shoulders that flared out into wide sleeves. The skirt continued to be full and bell-shaped until around 1865, when it began to lose its volume at the front and move its emphasis toward the back. Hair was worn with the center parting tied into low chignon at the nape of the neck, with loops or ringlets covered the ears. Ornaments for evening wear include floral wreaths, ostrich feathers, pomegranate flowers, wheat ear, and butterflies. For men, in the 1860s, it was fashionable for men's coats and jackets to be single-breasted and semi-fit, extending to the mid-side. Waistcoats were often collarless and single-breasted, and trousers were occasionally cut from a narrow check cloth. High starched collars were worn with cravat and neckties. Hair was parted from the center and moderately waved. A particularly hairstyle known as Dromedary whisker or Piccadilly whippers were long pendant side whiskers worn with a full beard and drooping mustache. In 1870s women's fashion placed an emphasis on the back of the skirt, with long trains and fabric draped up into bustle, with the abundance of flange and ruching. The waist was lower in the 1870s than the 1860s, with an elongated and tight bodice and a flat front skirt. Low square neckline was fashionable. Hair was dressed high at back with complicated twists and rolls, falling to the shoulders, adorned with ribbons, bands, and decorated combs. Hats were very small and tilted forward to the forehead. Later in the decade, wider brimmed picture hats were also worn, though still tilted forward. For men, coats and jacket were semi-fitted and side-length. Generally both jacket and waistcoats were buttoned high on the chest. Shirt collars were stiff and upstanding, with the tips turned down into wings. Hair was often worn parted in the center, and most forms of facial hair was acceptable, though being clean-shaven was rare. 8080s. 8080s women's dress featured tightly fitting bodies with very narrow sleeves and high necklines, often trimmed at the wrist with wide frills or lace. At the beginning of the decade, the emphasis was at the back of the skirt, featuring ruching, flouncing, and embellishments such as bows and sticks, rich fabrics, and trims. The middle of the decade saw a brief revival of the bustle, which was so exaggerated that the derriere punctured horizontally from the small of the back. By the end of the decade, the bustle disappeared. Hair was worn in tight, close curls on the top of the head. Hat and caps were correspondingly small and neat, to fit on top of the hairstyle. Men. For men, lounge suits were becoming increasingly popular. They were often quite slim, and jackets were worn open or partially undone to reveal the high buttoning waistcoats and watch chain. Collars were stiff and high, with their tips turned over into wings. Neckties were either the knot four in hand or version of the bow tie around the collar. 8090s. Women. In the early part of the decade, women wore tie bodies with high collars and narrow sleeves, much as they had done in the previous decade. From about 1893, however, sleeves started expanding into a leg of mutton shape, which was tied at the lower arm and puffed out at the upper arm. Wide shoulders were fashionable, and horizontal decoration of the bodies further exaggerated the line. Skirts were worn in a full length, simple A-line. Masculine styles and tailoring were increasingly popular, and women sometimes sported a shirt, collar, and tie, particularly when playing golf or out walking. Hair was worn high on top of the head, in tight curls. Hats were small or wide with lots of trimming, but generally worn squarely on top of the head. Men. The three-piece lounge suit was very popular and regularly worn from the 1890s onwards, and it became increasingly common to have creases at the front of the trousers. Frock coats were still worn, but generally by older or more conservative men. Collars were starched and high, with the tips pressed down into wings, though by the end of the century collars were more frequently turned down and worn with the modern long knotted tie style. Hair was cut short and usually parted at the side. Heavy mustaches was common, and older men still sported beards. Some men now went clean-shaven. The novel My Antonia was published in 1918. The novel tells the story happened at the end of the 19th century. The author describes some fashionable items back in those days, especially at the time when Tony and Jim grew up. And Tony started to put a lot of attention on clothes. I put down some examples I found in the book. On the third example I found in page 79. At 3 o'clock, one met little girls in white dresses and little boys in the round-collared shirt of the time. Mrs. Vanny always dressed in lavender with a great deal of black lace, her important watch chain lying on her bosom. She rolled her hair on the top of her head, built up in a black tower with red curl combs. Mrs. Vanny dressed exactly like what I described in 80s, 70s, and 80s, which you can tell she's pretty trendy. And this is my citation. Thanks for listening.